And then very quickly, I maybe before Marilyn starts us with the conversation, I'll just mention, so I'm a full professor in the history department. And a few years ago, I had both, and I had a Fulbright grant to do research in France and an ACLS grant that allowed me to spend a year as a fellow at the Humanities Research Center. So I have a fair amount of experience in applying for grants, but I'm also the director of the Humanities Center, as I think Catherine mentioned. And the Humanities Center, as the director of the Humanities Center, I am happy to help people with grant applications, and have done that many times over the years, and occasionally put out an email to remind people that the Humanities Center is here as a resource to help you locate grants. But also, if you are working on an application, I can gather faculty who have experience in applying for fellowships to vet your applications and give you feedback. And you need to remember, that's one of the things we'll be talking about today, that when you write to apply for grants and application and fellowships, you need to be writing both for people who are experts in your discipline and your narrower fields, but also for a wider audience. So I often, and because I'm in the Humanities Center, I've gotten to know lots of faculty across different departments, so I can reach out to different people and maybe have people from 3 different departments read over your application. So that's another resource to keep in mind. And anyway, Marilyn, why don't you briefly talk about your experience applying for grants, and then we can go ahead and launch the plan.
Yes, like Denise, well, I had a postdoc right after I finished my doctoral studies. So that was a kind of a fellowship in Canada. And then I spent a year as well at the National Humanities Center, which is a great place to do humanities research in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. And then some years after that, I had an NEH fellowship. And a few years ago, I had a Fulbright. So I've applied, obviously, for all of those, sometimes several times. The NHC fellowship I got the 3rd time I applied. So one of the things I would stress is the need to just be on out there, keep on trying, because I've not gotten many more fellowships than I've gotten. And you can't get them if you don't keep trying, because the competition is fierce. I've been applying for a lot right now with the project I'm doing at the moment, and the funding rate is about 6 to 7%. So it is a very tough time to be out there prospecting. And maybe I'll just start there, Denise, because the first thing I thought maybe was worth saying today is that, we think of applying for grants and fellowships, they're an end in them. It's a means to an end, to get money, to get time, to work on a project. And that's true. If you get one, that's great. But I want to stress that that's not the only thing you can get out of this process. One thing you get is a chance to think about the project and articulate it for yourself, as well as for that, interdisciplinary committee that's going to be reading your application. And that in itself is a useful process. I wrote my first application for this current project in, I think it was 2015 when I applied for the Fulbright. And when I look at that description and what I'm sending out now, they're very, very different. The project has evolved and developed in certain ways, partly because of that process of review I've gone through with lots of different fellowships and committees. And not to say that I take everybody's advice, but it does make you see, okay, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses? This project as originally conceived would have taken 20 years to write, which I didn't care to spend right now. So, that was a good thing to learn. Events overtook it. All sorts of things happened along the way, but that is part of the process of owning it. So that when I went last summer to write a book proposal for this book for Oxford University Press, that was pretty easy to do because I'd spent several years already describing the project, outlining the chapters, doing all those. A lot of the work is the same kind of work. So I know that my book proposal proposal was stronger and better and easier to write than it would have been without that process. And I've gotten, 2 positive reviews. It's going before the Board of Delegates, a week or so. So, that's all very good. Another reason to apply for things is that it makes the university happy. The university wants people out there hustling for things. Back when I first started, you could get time off without too much trouble. You could put something together. But then they began more and more to require people to apply for external grants in order to even be considered for internal grants. And that was a way of narrowing the pool, I'm sure, but also a way of encouraging people to get out there and apply. And people did really well. Georgia State faculty have won a lot of these grants that perhaps they wouldn't have if they hadn't been sort of forced to apply for them. So it makes the university happy. And something I didn't understand until just a few years ago is that winning grants is great. Of course, everybody's happy when you do that, but that it's also worth putting on your CV, even that you've applied for certain grants. That in itself is considered professional development. As it should be, really, because it is a time-consuming process. And, in the humanities, it's different than the sciences. In the sciences, obviously, there's an expectation that you'll do this. In the humanities, not as much. You could have your whole career and never apply for anything. So it shows that you're a striver. You're out there, you're pushing. And this is a way as well to make good contacts beyond the university. Because, they get people to read these applications and they try, to get someone who's at least somewhat in your field. So you never know who's going to be reading your application and what might possibly come out of that in and of itself. And because when you're applying for these things, you have to, in almost every case, you have to provide names of people who will write letters of recommendation for you. And, usually it's best if these are not your dissertation director or a colleague, so you're sort of forced to go out and make contacts with other scholars in your area. And that is a very useful exercise, especially if you're pre-tenure, because you'll be coming up for tenure, you'll be coming up for promotion, and you'll need then to provide names of people who can speak to your credentials. And it's great to have some people and senior scholars in your field who know your work well and have already written about it, and so are more likely to agree when the university calls and says, will you evaluate this person's dossier? So that is another great benefit of just applying, again, regardless of how the competition comes out. So I just wanted to put those thoughts out there. But of course, the jackpot is if you actually get something. And it's time, it's money, it's a chance to focus on research, which you really almost can't get any other way anymore.
So should we go on to the next topic? We didn't go over our planned agenda, by the way. So our first topic 1, item number 1 on our agenda, which Marilyn just covered, was why bother applying for fellowships. And the next one is how to find fellowships. After that, Marilyn will talk about the application process itself, and then I will talk a little bit about the review process so that you're familiar with how things go once you submit an application. So to move on to item number 2, how to find fellowship opportunities. Especially since we have some new people here with us, I wanted to emphasize one important place to start is to make sure you don't forget about our internal resources here at Georgia State. We have various kinds of internal grants that are available to you, some of which are explicitly focused on supporting faculty who are planning to apply for bigger grants and fellowships. So you should go check out the website for the University Research Services Administration, also Catherine's website and Catherine's focus on faculty affairs. They have resources there. So remember to pay attention to resources internal to Georgia State, research initiation grants, and so on. With the current budget situation, I'm not sure if some of those things may have been put on hold temporarily, but they hopefully will be. If they're not still available immediately, they'll hopefully be back very soon. And that's true for people across disciplines. Both Marilyn and I come out of the humanities, but I know we have a couple people here from other areas, and certainly the internal support services for grants and helping people find outside resources, outside funding, is something that's available to all of us, regardless of our fields. So what we mostly know about, though, is, again, more in the humanities and the humanities-like social sciences. There are a handful of broad, well-known fellowships that are available to people in a wide variety of fields, things like the National Endowment for the Humanities, the ACLS, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Guggenheim. If you get to that stage in your career, once you've gotten some of those other big ones, the Guggenheim is the next one. But also the Fulbright grant that someone mentioned earlier. And Fulbrights, too, are open to people in all different disciplines, whereas the others I mentioned are more focused on the humanities. And you should, if you're interested in traveling, you should definitely check out the Fulbright website. There's a wide range of Fulbright grants out there, some of which are focused on teaching, others are more research oriented. And they vary country to country because the agreements are made on an individual basis between the US and the country you'd be going to. So the opportunities vary depending country by country. And so it really takes time to kind of go on the Fulbright website and see what's there that might fit your areas of expertise. And sometimes even down to regions. So I specialize in French history. I had a Fulbright to France, and I know that they launched a new grant specifically for people who want to work in laboratories in southwestern France around Bordeaux. So like if you have a colleague who works in an area in computer science in Bordeaux that relates to your work, you'd probably have a very good shot at a Fulbright if you applied for it for that specific program. So sometimes it's about digging down deeply, deeper and finding those specific opportunities. There are lots of other private foundations that fund humanities research in particular. So, basically, again, it's about doing research. In terms of if you're willing to travel, also, there are a lot of institutions that support residential fellowships. The National Humanities Center, where both Marilyn and I spent a year, is absolutely wonderful in North Carolina, and it's independent, though it's associated with the Research Triangle universities. There's also humanities centers at most of the major research universities have humanities centers that fund fellows from other universities at various stages of their careers and in various areas. And then also specific libraries, museums, archives. So places like the Getty Museum or the Huntington Library or the Newberry Library. If there are places like that that have collections related to your research, you can apply for fellowships of various lengths. They usually have like 3, 6, and 9 month fellowship opportunities, for example, to go and research in their collections. And then don't forget about the Institutes for Advanced Study at, again, many, many universities all around the country. Princeton's is probably the most famous, but there's many of them. And you could be applying for those kinds of opportunities as well if you have the flexibility to be able to pick up and live somewhere else temporarily. In terms of where to find these fellowship opportunities, I would say probably in addition to using the internal resources here at Georgia State for helping you find things, the number one place to look is at the websites of your professional organizations. So for historians, that would be the American Historical Association. They're constantly posting fellowship opportunities for historians. The MLA does the same, people in the literary fields. And I'm sure the same is true for all of your disciplines. So you have big national organizations like that may have thousands of members and will list very broad opportunities, but then also narrower ones. So again, I'm a French historian, so there's the Society for French Historical Studies, and they have a very nice website where they're posting opportunities available for people in French history. So that's what I would recommend you do, really focus on those websites. And then finally, don't forget about smaller grant opportunities that are out there. And again, it gets back to what I was saying earlier about things like libraries and archives. Most special collections in libraries, museums, and other kinds of libraries and archives have smaller travel grants available for people who want to work in their collections as well. And though they may seem small, $500 or $1,000, it really helps. It allows you to go and do that research, but it's also, there's this, the phrase success breeds success. Getting those smaller grants and having them listed on your CV, in addition to actually doing the research, may also make you more competitive for some of the larger grants. So I'll stop there and let Marilyn take over on the application process. And we plan to finish pretty early, so we'll have lots of time for a question and answer.
Yeah, so the process in general, I mean, it differs slightly depending on what exactly you're applying for, but I think there are some general steps. My first piece of advice would be to apply for several grants at a time because it's a lot of work to do them. But once you've done one, it's much less work to do another one and another one. And if you're applying for a few, at least you have a somewhat better chance. You're doubling your chance or tripling your chance, and asking, again, someone to write a letter for you, that's a big ask. But asking them to do multiple letters for you is not such a big ask, because if they've already written the letter once, it's no big deal to change it a little bit and send it to somebody else. So it's there's an economy of scale that I think is worth investing in. If you're going to take the time to do it, take the time to maximize your chances. And it does take a lot of time. So, go in expecting that it is going to take a lot of time. I probably could have written several articles in the time it's taken me, and sometimes I wish I had. But anyway, it's worth doing, and certainly worth doing when something comes through, but it does take time. Your chances of winning any specific grant are small, but again, the more you have out there, the better your chances are. Don't give up if you don't get one, especially if it's the first outing with a project. It takes a while to kind of really get it down to your description, to be able to describe it clearly. It may take 2 or 3 cycles before you really have a proposal that you're really happy with. So, don't expect things to work out right off the bat. If the granting agency allows you to see the comments of the reviewers, as for example, the NEH does, you can request those reviews. By all means, get them. And I learned that it's worth asking for them even if you win. You win, you might not be that curious about why you won, but it's actually quite useful to know what it was that scored for you, what cut through. So whether win or lose, get those get those reviews and see what people are saying. Ask to see winning proposals. Sometimes a granting agency or organization will print, they'll put like a sample proposal on their website. And you can look at it and see, okay, this is what they're looking for. Sometimes they don't do that, but you might be able to find someone, a colleague, a friend in your field, someone who's gotten one. Ask to see their application. Not to slavishly copy, but just to have some sense of what works in a particular competition. When it's feasible, and again, it depends from organization to organization, but many have program officers who are very happy to talk with you. The NEH, for example, you can contact a program officer and talk about your proposal and get sort of personalized advice. I haven't actually done that when I've been applying to the NEH, but I've had a few small grants from the Georgia Humanities Council, or now it's just called Georgia Humanities, and these were for public programs to put on a lecture at Georgia State or somewhere else. And their staff was wonderful, kind of walking me through the process, explaining what I could and couldn't ask for, what would be considered reasonable, what I could use as in-kind donations to balance the money I wanted from them. So they were really wonderful. I mean, especially places that aren't inundated with applications want to help applicants make their applications stronger. So they're often happy to help. And I mentioned this already, try to look at the application process itself as worthwhile, apart from the result, that going through these steps, writing these proposals has a benefit to you just in terms of thinking through your project, as that's separate from whatever result you might have. So the pieces of an application. There's almost always an application form, fairly self-explanatory, but just be sure to consider carefully what you call the thing. The NEH, for example, provides detailed advice on how to title your project, which might not be at all how you would title the book resulting from your project. But just, read the fine print if there is any. But just know that that's one of the first things reviewers will see. So it is important. If they ask you to write an abstract or a synopsis of the project, that too is very important. Simply again, because it's the first thing someone who's reviewing your proposal will see. Often there's a place either on that application form or in a separate, abbreviated CV of some sort, where they'll ask you to list any awards or honors you've had before, in addition to things like jobs and education. And be sure there to explain any references. Don't assume that people will know why they should be impressed by, I had a Killam postdoctoral fellowship. Well, that's a big deal in Canada, but if you've not been to Canada, you might not know. So if there's any doubt about what something is, explain it, especially if you've won a prize in your field. Have a line or two just explaining what that prize is. Be sure there are no typographical mistakes or other kind of careless errors. Get as many people to look at your application materials as you can. And I make a point of showing my application to, colleagues who aren't directly in my field, who are in my discipline, but not in my subfield. I make my husband read them. He is a professional editor, but still, I would make him read them anyway. You want to make sure that what you're saying is coherent and understandable to a non-expert. So I'll talk, and I'm sure Denise will talk more about that too. I mean, chances are that the people reading your application will have some background in your discipline, but probably will not be experts in your subfield. So you always need to pitch everything so that it can communicate with that more general audience. Try to make every available field work to your advantage. Years ago, I was on an NEH evaluation panel, and I read about 50 applications, which was very, very educational. It was a lot of work too. And there was a field on the application at that time that said, additional information. So candidates who felt the urge could put anything they wanted in there. And a lot of people left it blank. They didn't provide any. The canny people made use of that field. Maybe they would talk about conferences they'd organized on the subject of their research, or, oh yes, I've delivered 25 conference papers on this topic that I didn't have room to list in my 2-page CV, or, I've published X number of scholarly articles that didn't fit directly here, or I've given such and such number of talks at other universities. So, think about what you can do with every space. There was another field then called description of duties, which again, many people just sort of glossed over. But people with heavy service commitments made sure that we knew they had heavy service commitments. And even though technically we weren't supposed to consider any of that, we were just supposed to think about the project itself, all of the people on the review panel were academics themselves who understood that being graduate director is a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. You don't have as much time to do work. And given a choice between that person's project and a comparable project from someone who didn't know had that, you did sort of tend to favor the person who had achieved against the odds. So don't let any space go to waste. In the narrative description of the project, that is the most important part of any fellowship application, because it has to demonstrate to the reviewers what the finished book might read like. It has to be an example of your very best writing. And it has to sound, like you, sound like the book. Follow to the letter any instructions. If they say 11, nothing smaller than 11-point type, nothing more than 3 pages, then you must do that. You can't get away with 10-point type or slipping in an extra half page or anything like that. That'll probably just disqualify you right off the bat. Because all of these organizations get far more applications than they can possibly fund. So as reviewers read your work, they're kind of looking in a way for excuses to throw it out, not keep it in the pile. So don't give them any excuse to do that on a technicality. Aim for a general audience, as I said. Be sure in that narrative, and as I said, you can recycle a lot of this material from application to application, but you do need to take the time, maybe just a few hours, to tailor it specifically for each different application that you do. The formatting instructions are a little bit different. The criteria are slightly different. Their mission is a little different. So you have to make sure you're tailoring what you say to the specific one. And any criteria, all criteria listed on the application, if they say we're looking for X, Y, Z, and Q, then you need to talk about X, Y, Z, and Q. The NEH application used to be pretty vague. It would say, here are some things applicants have talked about in the past, and they'd list like this long list of questions. And it sort of sounded like it was optional. You could sort of pick the ones that you felt most like talking about. But that wasn't true. When it came down to it, only applications that talked about all of them really had a fighting chance. So, if they mention it as a criterion, be sure that you address it somehow. Often they'll want you to situate whatever it is that you're doing in the context of other scholars' work and explain how it will make an original contribution. That's what they're looking for, is what is your unique take? What is the thing that people will get from your work that they can't get from the texts or projects that are already out there? Having a detailed plan is very important. Almost always they'll ask for this explicitly, but even if they don't, it's good to put it in there, an outline of chapters. This is what I'm going to talk about in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Explain exactly what's been done so far, what remains to be done. Nobody should have any doubt after reading your application what you plan to be doing during the term of the fellowship. That's a critical part. So try to be specific and also try to be realistic. The first few times I applied for things, I would be like, oh yeah, I'm going to write this book in the next year or 2 years. And that was always wildly unrealistic. And I learned later on that it's okay to be realistic. It's okay to say, yes, I'm planning to write 4 chapters of this book. And that doesn't make you sound unambitious. It makes you sound like a seasoned scholar who knows how long it's going to take to do certain things. Timing is key, I think, and I can't be as specific as I'd like to be about when exactly is the right time. But I can tell you that on my last book project, there was a book I worked on for a very long time, over many years. And so I was out there applying for things over many years. And there were some years when I had to get nothing at all, not even a nibble. And other years when I'd win 2 or 3 major grants. So from that, I conclude there are certain sweet spots in the life of a project, but I can't tell you exactly where they are. My sense is that one is near the beginning, maybe not at the very, very beginning when it's just an idea, but maybe when you've gotten to the point where you can at least outline the chapters and describe the project in some detail. That's a good place. And I also think, at least I hope this is the case because this is where I am now, I think near the end is another very good spot when they feel like, okay, a few months to finish writing up and this project is out into the world and we'll get credit for supporting it right off the bat. That's another good spot. But the important thing is you're out there trying all along the way so that you don't miss whatever that spot is in your own project. Reviewers need to feel confident that the work will be finished and that it will be finished, somewhere in the ballpark of when you say it will be finished. So it's very important, especially if you've had some grants before, small, that you have something to show for them. This is definitely the case when you're applying for an internal grant. They'll always want to know, well, have you had one of these before? And if so, what happened? Did you do what you said you were going to do? And that's true for other things as well. Clarity is essential. You need to signpost your description so that it's very easy to follow. Leave some space on the page so it's not too daunting. Remember that people are going to be sitting there. It used to be with a stack of paper. Now it's probably in front of a screen. And they're reading 30 or 40 or 50 of these. They're not going to have the time or the patience to sit there trying to figure out what you're trying to say. It has to be easy to read and understand. I think the biggest mistake a lot of people make is trying to sound really profound, really intelligent, to impress reviewers rather than to communicate with them. As I like to say, your goal is not to sound smart. Your goal is to make the reader feel smart when they read your application. Oh, yes, I understand this. I see exactly why it's significant, why it's important. And oh my goodness, they should fund this. When you're discussing your approach to your subject, there's almost always a question about methodology. How are you going to do this? I think it's really important to include at least one kind of detailed example of your methodology in action. You don't have time to do that to that degree of detail as you describe each chapter, but you at least want to show them what you mean when you say, I'm going to do this, this, and this. Okay, here's an example in this chapter. Of how that works. And I think I've touched on this already. Show your project description to as many people as are willing to read it and just see what they take away from it. It's all about seeing what's getting across to someone who basically isn't you, doesn't know all the things about your project that you know. How effectively are you conveying that to a general reader of the sort who might be evaluating your proposal? So I will leave that there, and Denise is going to talk about evaluating proposals.
Thanks, Marilyn. So one point that Marilyn didn't get to in going over the application process is letters of recommendation, which was kind of the next topic from an outline from an earlier version. And I do want to emphasize how important it is to have and to work on having the best people you can find right for you, people who know you well, who know your work well. And yes, and remember that when you're asking someone to write a letter, it makes sense to have them sent to multiple places at once because it isn't a whole lot of extra work. And both Marilyn and I have served as fellowship evaluators now several times. And I know I look very closely at the letters and find them extremely helpful when I'm evaluating projects. Sometimes I find that the letter writers are better able to be explicit about why the project is so important because the actual application writer might feel like that would be tooting their own horn too much, And so finding somebody you know will really be able to talk about your project in detail and make it clear that they really know what you're doing and why it matters is something to think about. But going on to did you want to say something, Anna?
Yes, I did forget to mention the letters. It is better to have letters from people who aren't close colleagues or someone who's advised you or taught you in the past, especially the further you get from your dissertation. It is quite important, I think, to have letter writers who are not perceived as, your friends. And this is a way to get to know those other scholars in your field. It is a little intimidating to ask someone you don't know terribly well to do this for you. But bear in mind that this also is professional development for them. One of the things Georgia State will look at when they're evaluating a promotion dossier or a tenure dossier, have you been asked to evaluate other people's work? That demonstrates standing in your field. So it's not, it is a big ask, but it's not, there is something they get out of it too. And, people to ask. Maybe someone's reviewed your work positively. That would be a good person to ask. At least they've already read. Someone who's heard you speak at a conference and maybe came up to you afterwards and said, it was really good. That's a good place to meet people who might make good recommenders. People who ask you to contribute an essay to a special issue of something or a collection of essays, that's a good person, and they definitely owe you. So these are ways to kind of approach, I would say just in general, people whose own work you admire. It'd be great to start. I really, really like your work, and I think I'd be so honored if you would do this. So, it's a good thing to cultivate. It's a good thing to practice doing, and it is an important part of the application. And also, people are very, very busy, so don't be afraid to make it as easy for them as possible. As soon as your application is done, you ask them at least a month in advance. As soon as your own materials are prepared, send them to your letter writer so they have them and can do the letter when it's convenient for them. And don't hesitate to check them about a week before the letter's due, just to see if they need anything else and to make sure they haven't completely forgotten about you.
So I'm going to go over the review process very quickly. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'll try to do this in a minute or so. Remember that the people who are evaluating, so there are committees created to evaluate the fellowship applications. Usually it's a 3 to 5 person committee that does the initial screening, and those are meant to be people who are fairly close to the topic, but again, don't assume that they really know your own narrower subfield. And then as it goes up the line, the people will be more and more distant from your area for less and less experts in your own areas. And when you get to the final level of screening, and especially with the federal grants like the NEH and the Fulbright, it could be political appointees reading your stuff, not even academics at all. And so that speaks again to the importance of writing with clarity, that has to be your number one goal. But at the same time, you cannot dumb down the application, because that first level of screening will be experts in your area, at least the broader area that you're in. So evaluators, again, because they're reading so many of them, prefer well-written, engaging narratives that make it very easy to follow. Use subheadings to clarify what you're doing, so maybe start with an overall explanation of the project description or something like that, and then go through with subheadings. Most people end with a schedule, a plan for the work they're going to do during the fellowship period, and then maybe conclude with the broader significance. And don't forget about the little text boxes. Often people will leave those aside and do them in a rush at the last minute when they're submitting the application. But often, like in the ACLS applications that I've reviewed recently, there's a text box that applicants have to fill with a very finite number of characters, where you have to explain the significance, the broader significance of your project for the humanities as a whole, and that requires a fair amount of serious consideration. So don't leave those things for the last minute. And again, that's what the evaluators read first. because that's what opens first, you know, as you go through the application. So yeah, as you're working on it, try to put your mind, your head, you know, put yourself in the mind of the evaluators who'll be reading it. And another point that relates to this in terms of those evaluators and also the institutions, the foundations and other institutions funding you, don't assume that being at a place like Georgia State, as opposed to kind of a big name institution, will hurt your chances. If anything, I think it actually improves your chances. I know from being at the National Humanities Center, they were really happy to have somebody at Georgia State because it had been a really long time since they'd had someone from Georgia State, which was Marilyn a few years before me, I think, right? What year were you there? I don't know. I think I was there in 2010, so I think you were
1998, 99.
Yeah, so you see, they were excited because that we're few and far between from Georgia State, and they were all excited to have somebody from a small like a mining, the College of Mines or something like that in Colorado, who does like environmental humanities and was a professor there. They were so excited to have somebody for the first time ever from a particular institution. So being at a place like Georgia State is not necessarily a hindrance. If anything, I think it's actually a plus. So don't let that discourage you. And then the last thing, I think, just to reinforce one thing Marilyn said, is that timing is really important. And I think that there are some grants that lend themselves to the early stages when you want to go off and do research somewhere, especially those ones that are at particular institutions that house collections that might be important to you, or where in the other areas other than the humanities, where maybe you need to collaborate with colleagues in a lab setting or something like that. So things like the Fulbright, there are lots of Fulbright research grants that are ideal when you're at the beginning stages. And then others are more for when you're at the final stages, maybe within a year or two of completing the project. But if you're too far along and it looks like you're really just about done, evaluators might question whether you even need the support. So that could hurt your application. So yeah, there are some sweet spots, as Marilyn said, in terms of when to apply. But I think we'll stop there because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we have time for you to pose questions to us. Would anyone like to ask anything?
I had a question about just logistically in terms of like you crafting your plan for writing research and applying for grants. Like, how do you kind of incorporate this incredibly time-intensive work in with all of your other responsibilities? Like, what does that kind of look like during the planning stages as you're identifying grants that you want to apply for?
So you're saying, like, how do you balance applying for grants while teaching and caring for your family and all of that?
Right, and writing, right, everything.
It's the usual juggling. You know, I don't think that there's a secret, you know, or magic wand to make it happen. And as Marilyn said, you know, sometimes you're making a choice of applying for grants rather than completing an article, right? There is only so much time in a day, and you can only accomplish so much. And I think that you know, it makes sense again to focus your efforts on applying for applications when you're at that right moment to do that. And having, you know, so when you're thinking, okay, should I work on an article or apply to grants this semester, let's say, right? It might make sense to have an article or two come out and then start applying for grants on that project. Or maybe the other way around, if you really need to go off and do research somewhere, then that's the moment to put your efforts there. But yeah, you can't do it all. So I think that's a very good point to mention, just to get that out there, that we can't do everything.
Yeah, I think that's a really great um, sorry. I think that's a really good answer. Can you hear me? It doesn't help. Okay, there's the little blue line. And that is true. And I think that's a great answer. Another thing is just to maybe plan ahead. You know, if you know you want to apply for the National Humanities Center, say, I mean, that application is due usually in early October, but maybe you set aside some time over the summer to think about it and work on it, because you know, at least I would have a hard time doing it from scratch in September, which is so busy anyway. So, yeah.
Karen.
Oh, I was going to ask about some financial concerns. One is at the level of GSU in your department. Like our departments rely on us a lot for teaching and advising and service. And so the idea of you not being there for a year, you know, asks more of everybody else in the department. Does the grant itself kind of pay for the teaching that you're not doing, you know, so that they can hire someone else so that it's not as big of a burden on your department?
Yeah, that's typically how it works. So that's something we forgot to mention. You need to make sure when you apply to fellowships that you route your application through the usual organizational lines there, starting with the college grants office and through the university grants office. And that way, if you get a fellowship that covers your salary, there should be no organizational obstacles to you being able to accept the fellowship, get the leave from teaching. The fellowship organization pays you directly in most cases, though sometimes you have the option of having them pay the university instead. And that way that can alleviate some issues with benefits and that sort of thing. So the financial details you can work out kind of individually. But yes, normally if you go through all that process before you apply, that you get the approvals at the dean's office and so on, and there shouldn't be an issue. And then yes, they would use the money that they would have spent on your salary to hire instructors to replace you in the classroom. That's typically how it's supposed to work. Catherine, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I do want to piggyback on that. This is where fellowships are really idiosyncratic. And so it is very important to have the conversation early with your department chair and then start with me, and I'll send you to somebody else if you need to, because some fellowships actually do not cover your entire salary. And so you're asking for partial salary, which is fine. But we need to know that in budgeting. Some require a leave of absence. That is definitely something you need to request early on. And there are forms. One is an individual routing form that accompanies fellowship applications, and one in particular, the leave of absence form. If you don't submit that and get it signed by all the powers that be up through the provost's office, you are not guaranteed the leave. And so I would recommend that you do that. Having said that, Carrie, getting back to sort of your department, this is perceived as good for the university, good for the department, good for your career. It's an all-around win. So we will work with the department as much as we can to support this, and the departments that I've seen that have developed a culture where a lot of people are applying for these grants have baked that into how they think about service, and they forecast that in the future.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, I also was going to ask about what a lot of us for our research, I don't need to travel to do my research. It's done right here on my couch, like everything. And so I have trouble sometimes, like with the budget, like why am I asking I don't have place-based research. I mean, I'm starting to think I should so that I have an excuse to go somewhere. But so I don't know sometimes what to ask for because I don't need to buy equipment. It's really just to pay for my living or cover the cost of teaching. So I have trouble with that budgetary component when you're not buying things and you don't need anything.
Well, that's where the residential fellowships would probably be good for you. And so it's worth looking at, like just Google Institutes for Advanced Study or Societies of Fellows or Humanities Center fellowships, and see. Then sometimes they have themes year to year that change, and so you need to see what they're looking for the upcoming year, and if it fits, there you go. You can apply for it, and they don't require that you need to be in the space. It's a recognition that we need space and time away from teaching obligations in order to complete work. And in exchange for that, you're a member of a cohort of fellows who are all talking about their work together to some degree. And it's a wonderful experience.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add that, I hardly ever have to write budgets. You have to write them for internal grants because they're always geared to scientists. But when you apply for fellowships in the actual humanities, like if you apply to the AH or the ACLS or any of these residential, they almost never, it's just a set amount. Or it's not a set amount and you just figure it out after you get it, but you don't have to provide usually you don't have to provide a budget.
Mhm. Right. I want to make sure, in case you don't have the chat window open, that Catherine just had to leave and said here, she thanked us for organizing this thing. And then she said a few points from the Dean's office. First, in a nature of reduced state budget funds, grant funding can't be taken away from you by the university, so there's a measure of security that comes with grant funding. Second, my office can offer a little help researching info about specific grant proposal requirements. URSA offers tools to help you identify potential funding sources, but my office can offer some student assistant help combing through for details. Feel free to follow up with her office, Catherine's, or Dean Dan Diocampo, who's the Associate Dean for Research. So definitely take advantage of those resources and these offers. Again, a lot of it is the time-consuming work of just combing through the internet and looking for opportunities in your specific areas. Like we have a PhD student who just defended her dissertation and is off on a 2-year postdoc. She's a historian, she's a PhD in history, but she has a 2-year postdoc at the American Chemistry Society, Chemical Society, I think it's called. It's in Philadelphia because she works on the history of chemistry, like alchemy in the 17th century or something like that. But you never know, right? If you have to find these niche things, and if they're niche, that means that the competition will be less intense. Any other questions before we wrap up? We're just about out of time.
I have a question really quick. This is Michael. I don't have my video on. So I looked up Fulbright, and I found one that looks interesting, although the deadline's passed. But it looks like it's mostly teaching based. Like they're expecting someone to lecture for a certain amount. Is that normal?
A lot of the Fulbrights are teaching based, yes, but others are purely research. And again, it varies country to country. And yeah, I'm sorry you just missed the deadline, but they're annual. So that means that you have plenty of time to prepare for next year. And that's good news. Yeah, but keep combing that Fulbright site. There's so many opportunities. They're literally all over the world and they vary enormously. But it can be a wonderful, wonderful opportunity and experience to gain contacts with colleagues that could continue to be, influential in your career forever.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
This has been really great. Thank you so much. This is really informative.
We're happy that you found it useful. And yes, Marilyn is a huge resource on thinking through these details about what
Impressive.
to do.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah. So thank you, Marilyn.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up, but if you have any questions at any time, particularly those of you in the humanities, that's part of my job, is to help people in the humanities figure out how to do this. But in other areas too, and yes, definitely Fulbright, I can help with that for anybody in any field. So stay in touch. Nice to meet some of you and to see you.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Feel free to drop us a line.
That's right. Stay in touch. Bye.